Okay, we have next speaker is Simon Roy from the OECD. Simon leads the higher education policy team in the OECD's Directorate for Education and Skills. And the OECD's work program on higher education policy is currently focused on the issues of resourcing higher education, digitalization within higher education, and adapting higher education provision in the face of evolving skills demands and increasing requirements for upskilling and reskilling. Simon joined the OECD in 2017, prior to which he worked for 7 years on higher education policy issues at the European Commission. Simon, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Many thanks. Bom dia a todo. Today I sort of have the honor to talk to you about a topic about which I know actually relatively little, or despite the background that was announced. I say that because although the OECD is an international organization, we have actually worked in the area of higher education relatively little on the specific question of internationalization of higher education. So I think it's useful just from where to understand where this sort of talk comes from, I think, to think a little bit about what the OECD is. On one hand, it's a membership organization, it's a club of mostly rich countries, right? So if we go to the previous speaker, we're representing often the global north, we are representing the West. Among our members, the largest member is the United States. So we are also speaking in a context, obviously, that is particular. The other point is, what does the OECD do? I mean, it seeks essentially to share knowledge, to share evidence around effective public policies for policymakers and governments. The main people sitting around tables in OECD meetings are representatives of national ministries, of public authorities for different fields, including in the area of higher education. So that's essentially what we're seeking to do. In the area of higher education, we work and seek to work on sort of sharing in developments in policy in various aspects of higher education. It was mentioned we're working on funding, we work on cross-country activities, sharing widely in the membership, but also with individual countries. We're working at the moment with Portugal on its agendas, particularly for widening access and student success. So we work on these quite big issues, but on the same time, the question of international students, which often comes up, we haven't historically done that much work. But what I will sort of aim to do today is sort of say we have certain number of things that we can say because we collect statistics in this area, and we also have started a number of projects, including a particular project with Canada that's looking at some of the challenges around the question of managing international students. And I guess the main message we see at the moment is, in a way, public policy for internationalization in higher education is in a bit of a difficult place, if not to say it's actually in quite a mess in many OECD countries. Not necessarily everywhere, but I think for quite a long time, and as I speak as someone who used to work in the European Union, so I slightly recognize something that was previously mentioned also about the sort of I guess the propaganda around certain aspects of mobility and international mobility that is presented. But it's a much more nuanced and complex situation, and one that both institutions, like many of the people around the room, but also policymakers and governments are having to deal with. I'm going to talk a little bit, as I said, share some of the data that we have. I have to admit that the data that we have is in a way, not as updated as we would like. That often happens with international data sets where it's transmitted up to various levels. But I'll show you what we do have and some of the trends we're seeing, which complements what some of the points that have already been made in a way. We should say that we collect this data jointly with our colleagues at UNESCO, so the global approach to the international statistics. It's also jointly done with Eurostat. So in Europe, even more detailed statistics exist in this area. So we're kind of in the halfway house of the OECD membership. I'll talk a little bit about some of the patterns and trends we see in the various public policies that affect international mobility of students and international student flows. We've already heard quite a bit from the previous speakers about some of those trends, but I'll just sort of, I guess, strengthen that a little bit with some of the examples we see. And then I suppose finishing with some of the challenges we see. So I mentioned the policy is often in a bit of a mess. There are sort of, just to say, the issues in a way that policy and often higher education institutions, given the fact that higher education institutions are highly autonomous in most OECD systems, what are the big challenges and what are the issues that we see there that need to be sort of thought about and addressed, perhaps in many cases in a more coherent way than is currently the case. Very quickly, when we talk about the data that exists, international data in particular, but national data as well, particularly for Europeans, there can sometimes be a distinction or even a confusion between degree mobility and credit mobility. Credit mobility is basically what the Erasmus program primarily supports. It's where people go abroad for a small time during a study program that is hosted in their host country, but ultimately they get a degree from that home institution. Degree mobility is about crossing borders to acquire a full qualification, and that's what primarily international data measures. It's not without its problems. We're talking here about people who are leaving a place of origin and going to a place of study. How do we define that? And there's questions, and that has been defined, but the questions essentially ideally around prior education and prior residence are used. So if you did those things, you resided for a long time or you were educated for a long time in another place, and then you go to another country for your higher education, that's international mobility. That's what international students are. But quite a few of our member countries report foreign students, which is students who hold a nationality that is different from the one of their host country, and that's not good. But that's essentially some of the data that we have to work on and we have to work with, and that's something we need to think about in some of the charts that I'll show in a second. Basically, this figure was already mentioned, but we're getting on. That's incorrect. But basically, this is 6.9 billion. So there's basically so many. Yeah, the number of so 6.9 million mobile students in 2022. We've seen this really a very substantial increase in recent times, but also in terms of where that distribution of mobile, in terms of the destinations are. We basically still have around 40% of those mobile students going to Europe. We have then around sort of 20% each going either to North America or what we might call broadly Asia Pacific, but basically combining countries like China, Japan, and Australia and New Zealand, so very large destinations. And then you have remaining parts of the world which actually attract still substantial numbers, but considerably fewer international students. What we see there is a concentration, 4.6 million of the 6.9, so really around 2/3 in the OECD, which, as we said, however we define that, but essentially the global north. When we then talk about sort of the trends, what we see is actually quite large increases in the flows, particularly in Latin America, increases in sort of Central Asian regions, that includes sort of basically countries of the former Soviet Union. So substantial increases, admittedly from a lower base. So we're talking there, but these are interesting trends. So there are more people going to those places. We then have actually still considerable growth in Europe over the last so this is over the last 5 years. So we have seen an increase over the last 5 years, around 40% more international students in Europe. And then essentially in the OECD overall, an increase of almost a quarter, 23%. Much lower increase in recent years in sort of the Asia-Pacific region, although still growing. And I think then one of the more interesting points is relatively few people going to essentially the Indian subcontinent for study, and very low growth in North America in the 5-year period that we've seen. So we'll come to some of that North American pattern in a while, but it's sort of an interesting overall pattern within the world. If we talk about the sort of that distribution again, you have these big six of hosts of international students. You have basically there for largely Anglophone countries, France and Germany. Those are big countries in basically, again, global north. What you see in these trends over time is sort of varying patterns. On one hand, in the United States at the top there, also in France, sort of relatively sort of limited growth, shall we say. Compared with, again, over sort of a 5-year period, we have then much sort of more dynamic trends in a number of other countries, including the United Kingdom, where you see this really large increase in the last 5 years, or in the 5 years up to 2022. You see there we've brought in a little bit of the national data, the latest data that was reported in the United Kingdom, which is showing a sort of it going down again. That is obviously also before the most recent announcements in the United Kingdom that we've heard about there. Interesting, and it's also been mentioned, is the dynamic in Germany, which is, as sort of in a European context, that's very substantial, right? Big increases in Germany, Canada. Our data show relatively substantial increase, but again, very, very big policy change relatively recently under the Trudeau government, but now sort of we will see that maintained, even though there was not a government change. We will see that maintained, undoubtedly. Latin America, I mentioned the fact that there's sort of like a place where there wasn't so much international mobility, even within, I mean, a ultimately largely sort of coherent linguistic space. There wasn't that much cross-border mobility in Latin America, but we have seen some quite substantial increases in again from low bases, but in Mexico and in particular, and in Argentina. This Argentina being one of the main destinations in Latin America for mobile students, so students crossing borders. In Europe, we've also heard about some of the trends here. One of the big points is Turkey. I mean, Turkey sort of very much, looking at the colleague in the audience, but it's sort of emerging in a way as a major destination. Turkey we obviously put here in Europe, but it has its position, its strategic position, of course, between Europe, the Asia, and the Arab world, and that's something that certainly has been developing rapidly recently. Portugal, again, from a very low base, but we heard earlier about the fact that the number of international students in Portugal has been increasing substantially. This is still showing that trend in the Netherlands, in orange there, of increasing international students, but something, again, where we've seen relatively, well, over time, a policy change. which will probably inflect that curve relatively soon. In terms of just finally a few other regions, this is the some work we were doing with colleagues in another part of our organization with Egypt, actually looking at specifically what are the patterns there. But in the Middle East and North Africa region, you do have sort of this, you have had this development in Gulf states to attract and develop to develop universities and to attract international students, but you're seeing some growth in other and sometimes quite unexpected places. But one of those is in Egypt, where there's been quite a large increase in international students. And finally, in the area of the Asia and Pacific, we have seen sort of, I would say, some of the trends that I mentioned, and substantial growth in quite a few of the countries in that region, except with sort of the major trend that we see there, that sort of negative trend is New Zealand, where really has not recovered since the pandemic, whereas many of the other large importing countries did recover to some extent. If we think about sort of then like one of the other metrics that's often used is the weight or the proportion of international students within the overall national student body. And that's important in terms of, it's particularly important for sort of public funding of higher education, but also of other policies accompanying that, and also thinking obviously about how higher education is delivered and the content and the approaches that are being used. We have there the main standout at that sort of top end in terms of very strong proportion of, or very high proportion of international students within the national student population is obviously Australia. It was mentioned earlier that Australia basically sees higher education as an export industry. It is still, I can confirm, I think the latest figures do show that it's after the sort of basically minerals and mining, it is the largest export industry of Australia. So that explains that, but that's really, 27%, that's a really big proportion of international students in your student populations. You have within the sort of second tranche, actually not that much far behind the United Kingdom and Canada. This is data from depending whether it's 21 or 23. You have then sort of some countries in the middle, which include Germany, include this country, include France, and which are sort of around 10% or a little bit more or a little bit less in the student population. The United States is the one to always remember. The United States is seen as a big destination for international students, but obviously international students account for a very small proportion of students within the United States, and that's something that explains in a way why the debate is somewhat different in the United States sometimes from in some of these other countries, particularly other Anglophones there. And finally, you have the sort of the remainder of all the countries which we actually have UNESCO data for, where the proportions are much lower. And those do obviously include some European countries, but a lot of non-European countries. You have countries like Brazil down there. So a country with a huge higher education system, a population over 210 million, but with virtually no foreign students going there. The last sort of way we can, or often we think about this, the sort of metrics that we use when we look at the trends and the patterns in internationalization is sort of where do the students come in different systems, where do the students come from, in the different systems. And there, what we've ordered this graph in is from a somewhat Eurocentric perspective, is where is the proportion of, within looking only at OECD countries, what proportion come from Europe, elsewhere in Europe. And so you see within that, you have this sort of intra-European mobility that's quite strong in quite a few countries for varying reasons. We know why that's at the top end there you have Slovak Republic. We know what's happening there. It's sort of in between, probably it's relatively low numbers, but you have mobility with its neighbor in Czechia. You have Czechia there, which is basically mainly Slovak students going. You have Croatia, but Austria there, a lot of German students. So those are the sorts of patterns that we have for historic and cultural reasons. You then have other examples within Europe, which I would highlight perhaps. You have the legacy of colonialism very clearly evident for this country and for France in terms of where you have basically the global region. So you have Africa, you have Latin America and Caribbean. So you see that for Portugal, you see that for France. The United Kingdom is obviously a slightly more nuanced picture in terms of its historic colonial patterns, because you have very low proportion ultimately coming from Africa, but you have China, basically, as in other Anglophone countries, making up a very high proportion of those incoming international students. When we're talking about this, and many of these points have been raised already, we obviously think about, well, why is this happening? And obviously you have drivers from the individual level, from students. Why are students mobile? And you have the question of why institutions and governments as well want to attract international students, and that's something that we see ultimately variations, and we've heard in terms of and combinations of rationales, and we heard already about that. In terms of the student motivation, ultimately, it seems from the survey evidence that we do have access to, that the sort of motivation of acquiring specialized or more prestigious educational qualifications than would be available in your home location is kind of a key driver of mobility. But then there are obviously other sort of broader questions. One question, and that's one that's on the agenda quite highly, is the extent to which people move to study as part of a broader trend of economic migration, the extent to which they may wish to sort of study in a place with a perspective to stay on in that place. And that's one of the questions that we're sort of looking at, and where basically higher education policy and the activity of higher education comes into conflict often with, particularly recently, migration policy. We also have within there sort of general questions around sort of why people choose particular destinations in terms of the obviously the prestige and otherwise of the institution. But from the policy perspective, I guess it's a much more complex pattern. There is definitely a question, particularly in wealthy countries with aging populations, of attracting labor from other places. You could relate that also to the science pool, so it's strengthening the science system, strengthening the research system. It's sort of later on in that list, actually, but it's rather similar. But then there's obviously, and again mentioned often, is the revenue generating point for institutions. That is primarily the case for relatively few systems. We'll come to that in a second, but that still is an important point. But I would argue perhaps more of a point for really relatively few but high-profile systems. Then the questions around both soft power and promotion of values, the question of economic diplomacy. I have to say, relatively few examples in policy papers where people are seeking to develop international classrooms, also as for the benefit of home students, so internationalization at home. I think in terms of the policy sort of trends we see now, we've heard a bit about the sort of history of policy to promote internationalization. A lot of the earliest policies in this area were around varying forms of scholarship schemes, the Fulbright being one of those, but others in other systems for slightly different rationales being developed, often developed and run jointly by people working on foreign affairs and education. So it's definitely at the sort of intersection of diplomacy and education policy, but potentially also for the science policy and workforce policies there as well, although historically perhaps less. Varying sort of approaches. Obviously, we have things like Fulbright, we have things like chevening in the United Kingdom. You have, on the other hand, perhaps the German Academic Exchange Service, the DAAD, has a slightly different philosophy. The DAAD, by the way, was started not after the war, but well before, in the 1920s. So it's actually a continuity, I would argue. I don't know that whole thing about Reconstruction necessarily is the case. It's a continuity of that tradition of promoting mobility in a way for its own sake. Another area of policy, though, in what we've seen is sort of an expansion more generally, marketing, study portals across many countries. You can find those in many of the OECD systems. So that's in a sense gone beyond those relatively targeted policies to historically definitely a broader attempt to attract international students. But the challenge, and this is the more recent issue, is, and this is a chart, a relatively aggressive chart taken from a recent publication by our colleagues in the Migration Directorate of the OECD, is around concern about misuse of the education system as a migration route, essentially, and about potentially the role of both institutions and sort of students misusing the international route as a way in either to promote migration into countries. And that's something which is really one of the biggest tensions we're seeing in many of the systems that we're working with, is the tension between migration policy and education policy aims. Another issue is the financial one. We've heard a lot about the fact that plays a role. One thing to say is the idea of charging people from another place more than people from the place where you are located as an institution is not new and is not unique to international students. The classic example being the United States, where out-of-state students are charged considerably more in public universities than in-state students, and that's something that's extended in many systems. We have different ways of doing this, of differentiating the fees. You might, as the Finnish have done relatively recently, make that dependent on whether you study in a language other than the national language. The Czechs do something similar to that, but in Finland you pay higher fees only if you study in something other than Finnish or Swedish. So essentially you have those models, and in that policy, there's complexity within that. It was mentioned that Portugal relatively recently changed, a while ago now, but relatively recently changed its rules in that perspective. Germany is one of the few OECD countries that I think it's fair to say maintains a degree of equality between international and domestic students. France relatively used to, but relatively recently also changed its rules there. The other sort of and final areas is then ongoing discussion about the contribution of international students to workforce policy, to skills policy, to national as ultimately national economic policy through the supply of human capital. And this is also data from our migration colleagues looking at the staying on rate of international students in national economies. And we have really very high rates at the top end there in places like Canada, where essentially over a 5-year staying on rate of sort of getting on there for well over 60%. Similarly, actually in Germany, you have very high staying on rates from international students. Some of these other countries, like Estonia, obviously the number of international students we're talking about there generating that data point is quite small, but let's skip over that. Australia and New Zealand also high staying on rates, much lower staying on rates actually in the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and very low in places like Denmark and Norway. Denmark, though I'm sure many of you will be aware, it doesn't stop people complaining about the number of people sort of staying on there. If we look at then, at that pattern and about what people are doing, a mixture and some interesting sort of microdata that we don't need to go into at the moment, but there's sort of people staying on either for further education. In some cases that might be if people do their undergraduate and then essentially end up doing a PhD or something, that they'll still be captured within these kinds of matrices, and then otherwise in a lot of people working, or in a few cases where a primary driver has been sort of family reunion. So there's quite a lot of different factors that are being examined in there, but a very complex picture. I guess then to sort of close, we are in this sort of situation where, as I said, we see a pattern where historically, I guess, in our policy reviews, in our work on higher education, internationalization and attracting international students was typically seen as sort of possibly a nice sort of relatively friendly, uncontroversial area around that we might talk about a little bit. There were certain things where we might talk about this. For example, in Portugal, it came up in reviews that we've done where the question of demographic change was a major question, where there was the question, to what extent can international students help perhaps fill study places in some of the institutions where there's a decline in demand from domestic students. These kinds of questions, relatively uncontroversial. But now we see essentially a range of issues that are coming to the head in a way in many systems that potentially require policy attention, but where often there aren't necessarily policy responses in place at the moment. There are questions around these stages, in the sense of the similar stages that we might think about in higher education policy more generally, is sort of arrival and admission to the system. There's questions there around particularly about the type of guidance and information that the students receive and whether that's accurate, whether they're attracted in a sense or brought to countries for the right reasons, and also for with valid and sort of a clear understanding of what they're actually engaging in. There's questions around the visas and permits and that obviously that we already mentioned. But one point that has been coming up in quite a few systems is the question of affordability and the extent to which international students do, or in fact do not, impact on the cost of housing for students and other factors like that. So that's one of the questions, for example, that we are looking at, how policy is trying to look at that in different countries for the work we're doing with Canada. In terms of study completion, this is one of the issues that is typically more a question for individual higher education institutions and departments hosting international students. But there is obviously the question mark over when you attract large numbers of international students to another environment, you have a responsibility, of course, for their success, and to what extent do you actually have that success? I mean, not necessarily for their success, but at least for that they have conditions which are conducive to their success. And that's something that we obviously do see large number of issues within, and where governments are keen to try and, in many cases, try and support that. But it is a very difficult question when you have in particularly in systems where there's a very strong economic incentive to attract international students. The question then of whether you actually support them well, whether you provide them with a level of education and a type of education which is consistent with the broader institutional policy, that remains a question mark. And then in terms of that post-graduation space, that's among, of course, some of the most controversial areas, is in aging OECD societies, it does often make sense to attract people to stay on after completing higher education. It's often even relatively, should be in some ways uncontroversial according to national sort of policy frameworks, because you're dealing with almost by definition high-skilled workers. But here is really where you're seeing many restrictions in recent times. The most recently, I mean, we've heard about the recent changes in the UK, in Canada, in Australia, in the Netherlands, in Denmark. So those sort of debates have not yet, perhaps are not so pronounced, I don't think, in, for example, the recent Portuguese election, but it is still something that's, given what we know about political trends in many OECD countries, which are unfortunately in many cases going in quite similar directions, those question marks there about the potential future of people in the country are live. There's obviously the broader question, which has always existed and relates somewhat more to that discussions that were raised by the previous speaker around the role of colonial powers, the role of the global north in sort of attracting the talent of the world and then ensuring they stay, because talented people who stay in OECD countries, obviously, who come from outside the OECD, are not helping or going back to help their own countries. So these are the kind of questions that we are seeing policymakers ask questions about, but where at the moment in our sort of world where we try and look at, well, what are countries doing and who is doing this well, where we see relatively few examples of people or countries or systems really getting this. The models are, in many cases, challenged in many areas there. And so I think there's a question mark also about this. As I said, that this was often seen as a policy area which was almost quite nice, quite consensual, and now is clearly not. But there is a need to sort of confront that and develop some good approaches and some consistent and coherent approaches, in a way also to counter some of the more unpleasant aspects of the political discourse that we're seeing around international students in many of our systems. So that's basically all I wanted to say for now. Apologies for, I guess, again raising many questions and not providing many answers, but that's the way of the world, I feel.
I'm not sure. Okay, yes, it works. Thank you very much, Simon. That was after a presentation of ideas, we had a presentation of data, and that's also very necessary. Thank you so much. I invite the audience to ask their questions, make comments. Yes, Yashar, please, here in the front row.
I think
there is a microphone coming.
Hi, my name is Yashar Kondakçı, for those who do not know me. Simon, in the presentation, especially on the map, you clearly indicate an imbalance around the globe. So there is a clear distinction between global south and global north. Is this a feasible question for national and international policymakers? Is there any kind of trend to change this imbalance? And especially regarding the developments in Latin America, do you think that this is a kind of development to kind of break this imbalance in international student mobility? Thank you.
Should I just start? I presume this is working? Yeah, you hear it? Yeah. I think we heard a lot about the origins, and I mean, there's a logic to why we're in the position with those patterns in most cases. It's sort of wealthy countries, and it's people traveling to historically wealthy countries or countries with prestigious higher education to acquire prestigious higher education, and also potentially to introduce that in in countries and systems which have the resources to provide, notionally high quality education. There are a few, there have been improvements in some degree in terms of the level of development of higher education systems outside the traditional hotspots. We've obviously, but nevertheless, the imbalances exist for much of the world. You obviously have places like, you have the example of China, where there's been the massification and a huge expansion of the domestic higher education system, but still, just by force of the size of the country, I mean, they're still sending out huge numbers of international students. I see relatively, I think you're probably, the people in the audience, probably better placed to comment on where they see that going long term. I mean, I don't see that the fundamental economics have changed radically at the moment. We do expect, I guess, what I read is that there is an expectation that the outflow of Chinese students will slightly reduce, perhaps, but that so far, that's been being predicted for a while, and it hasn't happened, just to my knowledge, yet. So that's one of the questions. For Latin America, the fundamentals remain the resourcing of many Latin American higher education systems. We did see that interesting trends in Chile, in Mexico, and I think that will, and that's in a way consistent with some of, Chile has one of the most developed higher education system. Argentina, up to now, I frankly, that's data before Milei took office. I'm not sure what state the Argentinian higher education system is in at the moment, but it's still the case. For example, for Brazil, which is a country that I have worked with more, where the vast majority of the system is not in a place really where it's going to be attractive or attracting international students. So you will get international students, no doubt, going to USP in Sao Paulo, but not, not more broadly into that system. And I don't see how the rebalancing will occur in terms of north and south. However, within the more generally, so I mentioned Turkey, you do see some rebalancing within, perhaps, depending on how you define that, the global north.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. Hans de Wit. First of all, a positive remark about the OECD. You are too modest in the role that OECD has played in internationalization of higher education, because in the 1990s, it has been very much driving the discussion about internationalization of higher education via its program, Institutional Management of Higher Education. So, and also with Education at a Glance, it gave a lot of data already for a long time. So I think OECD should be really much appreciated for its role. But on your data, I think this is very relevant, and to see the general trends, but there are many problems related to that, because everything is a question of definition, as you said in the beginning. What is an international student? Is it an international degree-seeking student? Is it a certificate student? Is it a student with a refugee background, etc., etc.? So, and the data that national governments give are not reliable in that sense, because there's not a common definition. So I think for the OECD and UNESCO, it's very important to be much more trying to push clarity about what we mean when we talk about international students. But then also in all those data, contextualization is very important. Each country has different arguments why things are going up or going down. The very clear example is Korea, which was always the number 3 in sending out international students, and now it basically has become the reverse, and that is for demographic reasons, etc. So how can you deal with that contextualization in your policies as OECD as well, understanding that? Again, Latin America is another example. Basically, the growth in Latin America is within the region, and it's mostly at the master level. and it's not getting students from Asia, it doesn't get students from Europe, and etc. So contextualization is for the analysis so important, and how to deal with that must be a big challenge for the OECD, I guess.
Yeah, but I mean, I mean, basically, I'm talking about, in terms of our role, the last 15 years or so. It's quite long now, right? I mean, so we haven't done much in that time on this subject. And I think, yeah, I mean, probably part of it is the difficulty of contextualizing different systems. I mean, we do different types of work. We do work that compares. We have the data underlyingly. There's sort of people working on that. Then there's data which compares patterns and trends across countries, which is the sort of thing where these charts that I showed today would come in, right? And then there's country-specific. There's work with individual systems and countries, and it's within that individual system-specific work. So as I mentioned, like we're working with Portugal on a different subject at the moment, but in that work, obviously, you get much more into all of the specifics around and the important points that were raised earlier about, you know, within a Portuguese context, you have that very important role of Portuguese-speaking places in other parts of the world and so on. So I would say we do a reasonable job when we're working at the individual system level, but then, yeah, this is an area where it is very difficult to generalize or to present more than broad trends. What I think we observe, let's leave aside the data, which, as you say, is very difficult to render fully consistent. But I think we just do see some trends in some of our major members, which are sort of moving in a sense to a greater hostility towards international students, and that's something that we think it's worth discussing. But you also know, I mean, the OECD in principle seeks to promote good policy based on evidence. A lot of the systems which are sort of turning against international students are not particularly open to evidence-based policy making. So it's not a particularly helpful environment. You know, there's not a lot we can do in some of that. But we want to, at least with places like Canada, where there is still a should we say, receptive audience to this sort of discussion, is have a discussion like, well, how consistent are your policies and so on, and maybe to share some of that experience. But as you said, I mean, we can't then, if we contrast that with Germany, I mean, Germany under the new government as well, I mean, is maintaining a completely different approach to international students. As far as I know, in German political context, there isn't a discussion over international students as being a problem at all. So it's quite hard to have. It's even harder than in many other fields of policy to have a good sort of policy discussion with multiple countries. You can have it with subsets of countries, but not necessarily across large sections of the membership.
Are there any other thoughts? Any other questions for Simon? Okay, I actually have one. If no one in the audience wants to ask anything. Okay, so increasingly we see that there is talk about international students being able to provide or represent a pool for future talent or future workforce, because the countries have aging populations, because maybe national students are not attracted to certain areas like STEM areas. And I was wondering if you see a tendency, because in the OECD you are maybe at the heart of where different national actors meet and you are at the heart of policy discussions. Do you see any trend towards linking more international student mobility to the workforce needs of a country? And I'm asking this because I know in Romania at the moment they are doing an analysis. Romania is keen on getting more international students, and they are doing an analysis on strategic economic areas or strategic development areas for the country, and for which they might bring in more international students because of lacking national students. So I wonder if this is a tendency, if you see this picking up in the future, linking workforce needs to international student mobility more tightly in policy.
I think some countries have already have long done that. Canada is actually one of them that historically has related it very strongly. Canada also had a huge, of all our countries, it's one of the highest rates of inward mobility, of inward migration of any OECD country, and higher education has sort of played a role in that. And there's been, that's a classic example. I think you see it within national internationalization strategies in a number of other countries. Finland's got an internationalization strategy which has some of that dimension, but it's not exclusive. It's not the dominant. It's not the dominant part. There's normally in a lot of systems around sort of the value of sort of internationalization for other reasons. I think the Australian context is another one where, although there was some sort of mention of the workforce relevance, fundamentally it's marketed as an export industry. It's just like, we must do this. Like, even domestic policy is driven, policy for domestic higher education is driven by the needs of international students. It's like our quality assurance system is there to guarantee international students that they're getting a good experience. But what about Australian students? That's like not in the discussion. So I think you do see there's variation, but whether it's growing, this relationship between we attract international students to supply skills to the workforce, I'm not sure I've seen huge changes there, but there are a few examples. But Romania is an accession country to the OECD. It will likely accede to the OECD. So we've just done a review of the Romanian system. We can see why they might be trying to do that. Whether they succeed in doing that entirely, through putting in place that chain where you attract the right sort of skills that you want for your economy, you educate them, and then they stay and are willing to stay on in your labor market, that's yet to be proven, for example, in that context.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so if there are no more questions, we break for lunch. And before that, I want to thank Simon for his very good overview of statistics on international student mobility. And I want to thank your engagement as well with his presentation. And we're back here at 2:30, I think. Yes, 2:30 for 2 more sessions in the afternoon. Thank you very much.